July 15th, 1942. The world is at war. Across the Atlantic, Europe burns under the shadow of the Nazi war machine. And high above the Greenland ice cap, the hum of 8 American engines cuts through the roar of Arctic wind. 6 P-38 Lightnings and 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses, young machines of war, gleaming silver against a gray sky, are flying in formation. Their mission? Ferry from the United States to Britain, a crucial leg in Operation Bolero, the effort to reinforce Allied air power in Europe. Each plane carries a young crew, hearts pounding under heavy flight jackets. Inside one of the B-17s, the pilot, Lieutenant Robert Wilson, grips the controls as the turbulence begins to bite. His co-pilot, a kid barely 21, glances nervously at the navigation chart. The white nothingness below is the Greenland ice cap, an endless desert of snow and death. Outside, the radio crackles with the voice of Major Paul Chapman, flight leader. "Stay tight, boys. We're almost to Iceland. Weather looks rough, but we'll punch through." But the weather has other plans. Without warning, the sky darkens. A swirling wall of fog and snow engulfs the formation. Instruments begin to dance wildly, altimeters spinning, compasses jerking. The air temperature drops fast. Icy crystals form on the propellers, the cockpit windows frosting over until even the horizon vanishes. The radio operator in one of the P-38s frantically calls, "Visibility 0, can't see a damn thing." Static answers him. The planes begin to lose visual contact with one another. Then, disaster. The lead bomber's navigation system malfunctions. The magnetic compass, unreliable this far north, starts spinning uselessly. They are flying blind, deep in the Arctic storm. Hours pass. Fuel levels dip dangerously low. Lieutenant Wilson checks his gauge and swears under his breath. "If we don't find land soon," he mutters, "we'll be dropping into the ice." Over the radio, a calm but firm order cuts through the storm. It's Major Chapman again. "All aircraft, prepare for emergency landing on the ice. Repeat, emergency landing." There's no choice. Greenland's coast is lost in white haze, and returning is impossible. The pilots lower altitude, the storm slapping their wings like angry fists. One by one, the planes begin to descend to what looks like a flat stretch of snow-covered ice. The first P-38 hits, skidding violently across the frozen surface before its landing gear snaps. Another follows, its tail cracks off on impact. Miraculously, the crew survive, scrambling out into the freezing wind, their breath crystallizing in the air. Lieutenant Wilson's B-17 is the last to land. The giant bomber slams onto the ice, bouncing once, twice, before finally grinding to a stop. The engines cough, sputter, and die. The only sound left is the howling wind. For the next few minutes, there is silence. Then voices, distant at first, begin calling out across the endless white, men shouting to one another, confirming who's alive. Against all odds, every member of the lost squadron has survived. 8 aircraft, stranded on an uncharted glacier hundreds of miles from civilization. They set up camp using what little they have: parachutes for shelter, flare guns for warmth. One man jokes bitterly, "Well, boys, welcome to the middle of nowhere." But under that humor lies fear. The Arctic is not forgiving. As the blizzard rages through the night, the crews huddle together, unaware that they have just become part of one of the greatest aviation mysteries of the 20th century, a story that will vanish under ice and silence, only to resurface 50 years later as the legend of the missing squadron. When dawn finally broke over the endless white, it brought no comfort, only the blinding reflection of sunlight bouncing off the ice. The men emerged from their makeshift shelters, their boots crunching over snow that stretched infinitely in every direction. There was no horizon, no color, no sound except the whispering wind. It was as if the world had been erased, and they were standing at the edge of nothing.
Lieutenant Robert Wilson squinted through the glare, shielding his eyes with a gloved hand. The air was so dry it burned to breathe. The wrecked B-17 sat behind him, its nose half buried in snow, engines twisted like frozen metal skeletons. A few yards away, the P-38 Lightnings lay scattered across the ice, silver birds fallen from the sky, their sleek bodies already dusted in frost. The men gathered in a circle. 8 planes, 25 souls. No radio contact, no landmarks, no idea where exactly they were. Their emergency beacons had failed to transmit through the storm, and the Arctic skies were silent. Major Chapman's voice broke the stillness. "We'll have to survive until someone finds us." The words hung in the air, heavier than the cold. The first task was survival. They scavenged what they could: rations, flares, medical kits, even insulation from the aircraft interiors to line their shelters. The B-17's engines, still faintly warm, were used to melt snow into drinking water. One crewman rigged a radio receiver, hoping to catch any transmission from search planes. Nothing. Just static. Endless and empty. Days turned into weeks. The storm cleared, revealing a haunting beauty. Towering ice ridges glistening in the sunlight, endless plains of white that seemed to breathe under the wind. Yet beneath that beauty was death. Temperatures plunged below -40. Frostbite blackened fingertips. Fuel for fires ran out. The men began rationing their food to a few bites a day. Still, their spirit refused to break. Every morning, they fired flares into the sky, praying that a search aircraft might see the brief flicker of red against the snow. Every night, they told stories of sweethearts back home, of the war they were supposed to fight, of the lives that were waiting for them beyond the ice. And then, on the 11th day, a miracle. A faint hum echoed through the frozen air. The men bolted upright, eyes scanning the sky. It was distant at first, a low drone, but it grew louder, a rescue plane. The crews scrambled onto the ice, waving, firing their last flares, shouting themselves hoarse. The aircraft circled overhead once, twice, and then disappeared into the clouds. They waited for it to return. It never did. Unbeknownst to them, the storm's magnetism had scrambled navigation equipment. The rescue planes saw nothing but snow. The radio operator, his voice cracking from exhaustion, whispered into the receiver, "This is the lost squadron. Anyone read me?" Static answered again. On the 14th day, they made a decision. They would leave the planes and try to trek toward the coast. It was suicide, 100 miles of deadly ice, but staying meant certain death. They gathered what little they could carry and began walking, the wind slicing through their heavy coats, the horizon shifting endlessly before them. Hours later, a distant shadow appeared. Not a mountain, not a storm cloud, but something else. A plane. This time, it was real. The rescue mission had returned. Smoke from their burned supplies marked the location. One by one, the stranded airmen were lifted from the ice, their faces cracked and pale, but alive. As the lost man climbed aboard the rescue aircraft, he looked back at the 8 warbirds lying silent on the glacier. The wind howled across the empty expanse, blowing snow over the silver wings until they vanished into the white. For them, the war was over. For their planes, it was only the beginning. Beneath the ice, time would stop, and the legend of the missing squadron would begin to grow. For decades, the frozen plains of Greenland kept their secret well. Long after the war ended, after the guns fell silent in Europe and the world began to rebuild, the 8 aircraft of the lost squadron slept beneath the ice, untouched, unseen, and almost forgotten. The men who had flown them returned home as quiet heroes, their story fading into the noise of a world eager to move on. But the glacier does not forget. Year after year, layer upon layer of snow pressed down upon the wrecks, each storm burying them deeper in the frozen earth. The Arctic wind sculpted new ridges, the landscape shifting like slow, grinding waves of white. By the 1950s, the planes were buried under more than 100 feet of solid ice, encased in a crystal coffin preserved by the cold. Then came the whispers. Fishermen off the coast of Greenland told stories of hearing metal echo beneath the ice when their hooks struck deep. Pilots flying over the region spoke of ghostly reflections on their radar screens, faint signatures that appeared and vanished as quickly as they came. Locals called it the graveyard of the sky. To some, it was a legend. To others, it was a mystery begging to be solved. In the 1960s, a Danish geological survey stumbled across a strange anomaly on their radar scans, metallic shapes deep below the glacier. The findings were logged, but never pursued. There was no funding, no interest. The world had gone to space by then. Who cared for a few planes lost under the ice? But among aviation enthusiasts, a quiet obsession began to grow. One name would come to define it: Pat Eaps, an American pilot and engineer from Georgia. Eaps had heard the story in the late 1970s over coffee with a friend. A squadron lost on Greenland's ice cap. 8 planes still buried out there somewhere, preserved by cold and time. It sounded like fiction, the kind of tale pilots tell at bars. But something in it stuck with him. He began digging, reading every record, every weather report, every military log that mentioned that flight in 1942. And slowly the legend became a map. In 1981, Eaps and a small team of adventurers decided to find the lost squadron. They packed their equipment, loaded up a DC-3, and flew toward Greenland, into the same white silence that had swallowed the planes nearly 40 years before.
From above, the ice stretched endlessly, featureless and cruel. It looked like a blank sheet of paper on which history had been erased. But Epps believed that beneath that surface lay one of aviation's greatest treasures. Their first expedition failed. Radar equipment malfunctioned in the cold. A blizzard forced them to turn back. But Epps wasn't done. He returned again and again. For 10 long years he searched, each time coming closer, each time defeated by the ice that refused to give up its dead. By the late 1980s, the team had one breakthrough. Ground-penetrating radar revealed faint outlines, metal shapes far below, buried nearly 250 feet down. The glacier had moved, shifting the planes miles from their original coordinates. They weren't lost anymore, just imprisoned. So they drilled, slowly, carefully, through ice as hard as stone. The sound of machinery echoed through the Arctic stillness, the first human noise the lost squadron had heard in nearly half a century. And then one day, in 1992, the drill struck metal. When the first glint of aluminum surfaced under the floodlight, the crew fell silent. The glacier had finally surrendered one of its ghosts. What they uncovered next would astonish the world. The perfectly preserved remains of a P-38 Lightning, buried under 268 feet of solid ice. They called her Glacier Girl. The wind howled across the Greenland ice cap like a ghost from 1942, carrying the sound of engines that no longer existed. But beneath that frozen wasteland, the lost squadron had waited. And now, for the first time in 50 years, one of them was about to see the light again. When the drill first hit metal, the sound was unmistakable, a hollow clang that sent shivers through the crew gathered around the borehole. Pat Epps leaned in close, brushing frost from his beard, his breath fogging the air. "We found her," he whispered. But finding the plane was only the beginning. What lay beneath was not a wreck to be pulled up with ropes and cranes. It was a monument, sealed in a tomb of solid ice, 268 feet thick, the equivalent of a 25-story building. To reach it, they would have to carve through the glacier itself. And so began one of the most extraordinary recovery operations in aviation history. The team built a massive, steam-powered super gopher, a drilling machine capable of melting its way down through the ice. It hissed and roared, sending jets of boiling water into the depths, creating a tunnel barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the walls slick and glowing blue with trapped air from centuries past. It was like descending through time. At 268 feet, their lights finally caught the dull gleam of metal. The plane lay there, wings folded slightly from the impact, her nose tilted down, frozen in mid-flight as if she had never truly landed. The P-38 Lightning, streamlined, deadly, beautiful, was astonishingly intact. The insignia on her fuselage was still visible. The machine guns still lined her wings. Even the pilot's seat remained in place, untouched since that July day in 1942. The men named her Glacier Girl. It took weeks of grueling work to free her. The ice clung to every curve, every bolt. The crew worked in shifts, using saws, heaters, and steam jets to carve away the layers. Inside the cramped tunnels, temperatures hovered near freezing, and the air grew thick with the smell of metal and antifreeze. They knew that one mistake, one shift in the glacier, could crush everything. Finally, after months of labor, Glacier Girl rose from the ice. The day she was pulled to the surface, the Arctic sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Her silver fuselage shimmered under the light, scarred but defiant. It was as if she had never stopped flying. When the news reached the world, headlines erupted. WW2 plane recovered from 268 feet of ice. Reporters called it a miracle of engineering and perseverance. But for Epps and his crew, it was something deeper. Standing beside the resurrected Lightning, they felt as though they were touching history, a story frozen in time that had finally spoken again. The restoration would take 10 more years. Glacier Girl was shipped back to the United States, piece by piece, to a workshop in Middlesboro, Kentucky. There, under the careful hands of craftsmen, engineers, and historians, she was reborn. Every bolt, every cable, every panel was restored to its 1942 glory. When her Allison engines roared to life again for the first time in half a century, men wept. The crowd that gathered for her first public flight watched in reverent silence as the restored P-38 Lightning taxied down the runway. The engines thundered, the air trembled, and Glacier Girl lifted gracefully into the sky, the same sky she had once fallen from. She was no longer just a warplane. She was a ghost returned to life, a symbol of human persistence and the beating heart of a legend that refused to die. And yet, the glacier still holds its secrets. Beneath the ice, more planes from the lost squadron remain entombed, their silver wings hidden in blue darkness, waiting, patient, eternal, for someone brave enough to bring them home. Even after Glacier Girl soared again, the ice refused to give up the rest of its secrets. Greenland kept her silence, cold, vast, and ancient, as if protecting what lay beneath. Yet for the men who had uncovered Glacier Girl, one recovered plane wasn't enough. Somewhere down there, 7 more P-38s and 2 mighty B-17s still slept, waiting under mountains of compressed snow. The world had seen the miracle of Glacier Girl, and now curiosity turned into obsession. Aviation enthusiasts, scientists, and adventurers from across the globe wanted to know what else survived. What stories still rested below, sealed by time and ice? In 2011, new technology gave hope. High-frequency ice-penetrating radar, drones, and GPS mapping allowed explorers to see deeper than ever. A new team of searchers, younger but inspired by Pat Epps's determination, returned to the same region, the same endless white expanse. They used satellite scans to trace faint metallic echoes, ghostly outlines of wings, tails, and engines beneath hundreds of feet of frozen layers. The readings were faint, but clear. More planes were down there. The expedition set up base near the same glacier field where Glacier Girl had been recovered. The air was colder now, the weather even more unpredictable. Climate change had altered the ice flows, burying some areas deeper while exposing others. It was dangerous, shifting terrain,
One wrong step can open a crevice hundreds of feet deep. Still, they drilled. The work was brutal. Steel tools cracked from the cold, generators froze overnight, wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour. Yet every scrape of the drill, every hiss of melting steam brought them closer to history. Then, on a gray morning in August 2018, the radar returned a perfect silhouette, the unmistakable twin booms of a P-38 Lightning. They had found another one.
It was lying slightly tilted, deeper than Glacier Girl had been, nearly 300 feet below the surface. The team marked the site and began the slow process of melting through the ice. It took weeks before a camera could finally descend into the darkness, capturing the first images. The plane's fuselage gleamed under the light, perfectly preserved, untouched by air for over 70 years. They called her Echo. Unlike Glacier Girl, Echo's wings were intact. Even her cockpit instruments were visible, sealed behind a thin layer of frozen mist. It was as if time itself had stopped, the last moment of 1942 captured in ice. Inside, they found artifacts, a pair of goggles, a torn map, and a service manual stamped with the emblem of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The team erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the tunnel. They had done it again, pulled another ghost from the glacier's grasp. News of Echo's discovery spread like wildfire. Aviation historians around the world celebrated it as one of the greatest finds of modern times. But for the explorers who stood there, frost on their beards, staring at the metal shining through blue ice, it wasn't about fame. It was about connection, a handshake across time with men who would risk their lives in a frozen sky. And yet, even as they worked, their instruments picked up more faint signals scattered across the ice. There were more. Somewhere to the east, deep under the moving glacier, a massive metallic reflection hinted at the presence of one of the B-17s. The thought made everyone pause. If the bombers still existed down there, massive, intact, loaded with wartime gear, then the lost squadron was not just a story of one plane or two, but an entire fleet preserved by the hand of nature itself. As the sun dipped behind the glacier, the light stretched long and gold over the ice. The men stood in silence, staring out across the endless white. The Arctic wind howled around them like a voice from another time. Somewhere beneath their feet, 7 more planes waited, frozen mid-mission, engines silent, wings locked in eternity. The lost squadron was still out there, watching, waiting, buried by time, but never forgotten. Night fell across Greenland's endless tundra, but the camp was still alive. The glow of floodlights bounced off the glacier walls, and the distant hum of generators mixed with the howl of the wind. Every person on that ice field felt it, that strange pull between past and present. They weren't just digging into ice, they were digging into time itself. Inside the team's small heated tent, expedition leader Mark Smithson stared at the sonar monitor. The faint blip, the one that could be a B-17, pulsed slowly like a heartbeat frozen in time. He leaned forward, tracing the shape with his gloved finger. "It's bigger than the Lightnings," he said softly. "Could it really be one of the flying fortresses?" a crew member asked. Mark didn't answer. He knew what that shape meant. The last confirmed radar contact of those 2 bombers was right there, in this part of the glacier. If that signal was real, it could be the holy grail of World War II aviation archaeology. The next morning, they began drilling again. The glacier responded like a living creature, groaning, shifting, cracking deep below. Ice cores came up gleaming blue, each layer older than the last. At 50 feet, the temperature dropped sharply. At 120 feet, the air smelled ancient, trapped oxygen from the 1940s. By 300 feet, they reached solid metal. When the camera feed went live, the crew fell silent. A huge shape appeared out of the dark. Rivets, wings, windows, the unmistakable round nose of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, still whole, its massive body buried in clear ice. The serial numbers were visible. This wasn't Echo, this wasn't Glacier Girl. This was Big Stoop, one of the original bombers from the lost squadron. The men just stared. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then one of them whispered, 76 years, and she's still here. The plane was almost perfectly preserved. Even the machine guns still sat in their turrets. The cockpit looked like the crew had just stepped out. But the deeper the camera moved inside, the more haunting it became. On the pilot's seat, still upright, a small notebook lay frozen open, its ink faint but legible. Visibility 0, turning east, ice building fast, God help us.
Those were likely the final words written by Captain Robert Wilson, the B-17's commander. The discovery was world-changing. The story hit international headlines. Lost World War II squadron found under Greenland ice. Documentaries, interviews, and history channels all reignited the legend. But even as the fame grew, the men on the glacier stayed humble. They didn't see it as treasure hunting. They saw it as a promise to bring home those who never made it back. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The team carefully cut through layers of ice, creating a tunnel big enough to stand in. Every piece of the plane that surfaced told a story. A compass, a coffee cup, even a jacket still bearing the faded insignia of the 8th Air Force. Yet there was something else too. A strange energy around the site. Radios sometimes cut out for no reason. Drones lost signal when flying directly above the area. The crew joked about ghosts, but when night came and the wind screamed across the ice, none of them laughed. On one quiet night, Mark stood outside the tent, watching the aurora borealis ripple across the sky. Colors danced, green, purple, red, like silent fire. In that shimmering light, he imagined the lost crew looking down, finally at peace. He whispered into the cold, "We found you. You're not forgotten." And in that moment, as the wind softened and the lights shimmered brighter, it almost felt like the glacier itself was listening. The next day, the radar picked up another faint echo to the north. Fainter, smaller, maybe another lightning, maybe just ice distortion. But Mark smiled. He already knew what they would do next. They'd keep digging, keep searching, until the entire lost squadron was found. Every single one of them. Because legends don't die in ice, they just wait to be rediscovered. Months passed. The Greenland glacier, once silent and undisturbed for decades, now echoed with the rumble of helicopters, the scrape of ice drills, and the steady heartbeat of history being resurrected. Under the biting Arctic wind, men in heavy parkas worked tirelessly, guiding cranes and saws, their breaths visible clouds in the frozen air. Piece by piece, the great bomber emerged from the ice. Its aluminum skin gleamed under the floodlights like some ancient relic of another age, its wings torn but proud, its nose pointing toward the sky as if ready to fly again. For the world, it was a marvel of engineering and endurance, but for the men standing there, it was personal. It was a grave, a story, and a promise kept. When the last section was lifted and secured on the transport sled, the team stood in silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. The snow fell lightly, soft as ash, as if the world itself wanted to show respect.
Back in the States, the wreckage arrived at an airbase museum in Georgia. Historians, veterans, and families of the missing gathered as the tarp was slowly pulled back. Cameras flashed, but the emotion in that hangar was too heavy for celebration. It was reverence. At the front stood an elderly man, Thomas "Tom" Wilson, the last surviving brother of Captain Robert Wilson, the pilot of Big Stoop. His eyes, clouded with age, filled with tears as he touched the cold metal. "He was 24, he whispered, "and he never came home. Until now." The museum planned to restore the plane, not to fly, but to stand, proud, scarred, and real. Every dent, every bullet hole, every inch of ice-burned steel told the story of men who refused to quit, of courage buried in silence and rediscovered through perseverance. But as the restoration team worked, they found something remarkable. Inside a sealed compartment, wrapped in what used to be a leather satchel, was a small metal canister. Inside, perfectly dry, was a roll of film. When developed, the photographs revealed the faces of the lost squadron, smiling, joking, young, taken just hours before the storm hit. One picture showed the entire crew lined up in front of their planes, the snow beginning to fall behind them. Someone had scrawled on the back in pencil, "If we don't make it back, tell the world we flew together." That photo would later hang beside the restored wreckage, framed under glass, illuminated softly in the museum lights. Visitors would stop, read the words, and fall silent, because in those faces you could still see it, the spirit of flight, the brotherhood of the air, and the quiet defiance that turned tragedy into legend. Years later, when the expedition leader Mark Smithson was asked what finding the lost squadron truly meant, he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. The glacier didn't just preserve planes, it preserved a story, one about faith, courage, and the kind of men who looked at the impossible and took off anyway. And perhaps that's why the legend of the missing squadron still lives on, not just as a mystery of the ice, but as a reminder of what humanity is capable of, even in its coldest, darkest hours. As the lights dim in the museum and the visitors leave for the night, the hangar grows quiet. The wind outside whispers faintly through the cracks, like distant engines in the sky. And if you listen closely, very closely, you might almost hear it. The steady hum of propellers fading into the horizon. The ghosts of the lost squadron finally flying home.